Hello, hello. The final book I'll be reading for my Polar Gothic series is All the White Spaces by Ally Wilkes. Hey, Karma. What you doing? Happy Monday, Karma. Gandalf, say hey. Gandalf. Karma, Frere. Can I pack what I need to pack, please? Excuse me? Hey, handsome date, wave. Hello, it's Sunday afternoon. It is January the 11th, and I am checking in with All the White Spaces. I haven't read very much, but there are going to be frequent check-ins because I have a lot to say in just a few short pages, and I don't want each of these check-ins to be too long. So we're just going to talk about what I've read so far. So I'm in part 1 now, which is titled The Fortitude. And the Fortitude is the name of the ship on which Jonathan has stowed away. And his brother's best friend, Harry, is on board with Jonathan and helped Jonathan hide down in the storage space below deck. So Harry is on board as an assistant to the dog master. And I want to talk a little bit about the experiences of Jonathan thus far on the Fortitude, being in hiding. So Jonathan talks about being locked in the bowels of a ship, crossing the most unsettled seas on the globe. Only one person aware of his presence. If he was thrown too hard to the floor, knocked out, he knew people could die unattended from such an injury. And should the lantern turn over, we're at the bottom of a 3-mast tinder pile. Harry had warned, be careful. So there's this isolation and this fear that even though the rest of the men on the ship are also isolated to some degree out here sailing, for the Antarctic, Jonathan's even more so isolated in hiding. And then also he talks about how Harry had agreed to help him on board, but at the same time, Harry could get into quite a bit of trouble for hiding a passenger. Now, we're also introduced to some other characters who are crew on the ship. We get introduced to the cook, who is named Macready. So obviously, Ally Wilkes, winking at John Carpenter's The Thing. I want to read this particular passage too, where Jonathan speaks about the cold, the darkness, and then the psychological effects of such conditions on the human mind. My candle burned down. The darkness was infinite. like being buried alive. I strained my eyes trying to make out shapes in the gloom. From my corner, the sacks and barrels and crates loomed, seemed to have grown bigger. Three sacks piled on top of one another made a crouching, rounded figure. The ends of barrels, stacked side by side on an upper shelf, were a pale row of moonlight faces, flat and expressionless, save for their scribbled ink mouths, shapes in the darkness, somehow watchful. I shuddered. And I know for, us as people, even in our very own houses, sometimes at night, especially if we wake up, we're sort of half awake, half asleep, and we see clothes piled up in a chair. We see something that we see in our rooms all the time, but then we feel like we're being watched by something, or we begin to make, these faces on these inanimate objects in our space. And I'm only imagining how much more so it would be for Jonathan, who's down in the very darkness of this ship and in hiding and starting to look around and begin to see threatening figures in something as simple as barrels. Now I want to read the anticipation and Jonathan's knowledge of how much worse those types of conditions are going to get. The Antarctic night would be far worse. In April, the sun would set for the last time, and we would spend months in a freezing dark unlike anything else on Earth. The ice we would spend the ice would be a desolate place ruled by shadows. I'd read descriptions of the overwinter, which I childishly once interpreted as the worst winter possible. I hadn't been far off. Men went mad under the weight of that relentless dark, melancholy, and paranoia, hoarding guns before turning them on their companions or themselves. It could happen to anyone. Man wasn't adapted to deal with the total absence of light. And this makes me think back to that idea of the cryo Gothic, that frozen in time, that nature reclaims territory, that this territory, this Antarctic region, belongs to nature. And especially these explorers were never meant to be in that space. And nature has a way of reminding you that you don't belong here. We also get introduced to a couple of other characters in the novel. We get introduced to Tarlington, who is the science officer on board. Tarlington is the one who discovers Jonathan and is very angry and keeps telling Jonathan how the commander, Randall, is going to throw him off and, you know, put him out there into the ocean in the middle of nowhere in the cold and freezing. And I want to also talk about Liam Clark, who is Randall's second in command. Looking forward to what happens next, but I'm also very, very nervous for Jonathan. So I'm going to cut this clip off now, and I will see you in the next check in. Bye. Karma, happy Monday. Good morning, Monday. Hello, it's Wednesday, January 14th. It's about 12:30 in the afternoon, so excuse my voice, but I do have a cough, cold, and sore throat, which is why it's been a couple of days since I checked in. but I thought I'd go ahead and check in today because I have read a few more sections. So I'm still in part 1, the Fortitude, but I read sections 5 through 7. That doesn't sound like a lot, does it? But anyway, I have a lot to say about those few sections, so I thought I better check in. So the last time I left off on the previous clip, Jonathan was being taken in to see Randall, who's the leader of this expedition. And when Jonathan gets in there, we get a description of Randall. And my question is like, damn, does every one of these explorers who's been on these Antarctic expeditions have frostbite? Because Jonathan talks about the evidence of the leader Randall's frostbite, talks about him missing much of his left eyebrow and having one side of his face that looks roughly sanded down. So Jonathan is in a very difficult predicament as being a stowaway on this expedition. It would be even more dangerous for Jonathan if it were discovered that biologically Jonathan is female, but identifies as a male. So for that to be discovered on a ship like this would be even more dangerous for Jonathan. But Jonathan talks about in one section how he did not want to go to boarding school where his parents wanted to send him. It would be an all girls boarding school, and that's not who Jonathan is. So Jonathan is facing not only this danger being on the ship, but just other, levels to that danger. So then we find out a little bit more about Randall in this conversation. Randall says to Jonathan, "Your brothers heard the call of the South. They're dead and gone. You'll not see them again. It's your own life at stake. Is this what you want, Morgan?" So Morgan says, "It's all I want, truthfully, sir." So it just reiterates the fact that Jonathan had this dream to go to the Antarctic, to follow in the footsteps that his brothers would have followed if they hadn't both died in World War One. So then there's a discussion. Jonathan is warned that he'll be sick at first. And Jonathan is smiling about that. This just really shows how much this is Jonathan's dream, because Jonathan endures all of this with a smile and a joy. For example, we have this description of the cabin being barely 6 feet across. Jonathan describes it as perfect. Okay, so first of all, on top of this dangerous expedition in these icy waters, you're telling me I'm going to be crammed in a cabin 6 feet? My claustrophobic ass is like, oh, hell no. Jonathan describes it as perfect. Then he talks about how he was getting sick. He describes the room as being claustrophobic and dark. And then even though he's vomiting, he's still like, "I'm smiling until my face hurt." I'm like, this is a definite dream come true for you if you're all, yay, here I am, in these icy waters, in this claustrophobic dark space. I'm puking my guts up, but woohoo, big fun. And then we also get some descriptions about the landscape and about the sunshine. The sun shone relentlessly, casting me into a strange world in which time held no meaning. So at this point, you're having those extended daylight hours, but a few chapters or sections from now, we will be getting to the portion where you begin instead to have the extended dark hours. So Clark, again, this second in command that I mentioned before, that's this very real gruff individual. Not that the leader Randall's not tough, but Randall seems to have more personality and a sense of humor, where Clark is just a very intimidating ass at this point. Harry's helping Jonathan clean something up, and Clark throws this big fit and is like, oh, Jonathan's got to learn to make his own way. So you go and you do your own thing. And then, despite Jonathan having to scrub this doggy deck, again, we see just how much this is his vision, his passion, and he's thrilled to be doing it. Here in my new trousers, I was finally free, standing as I'd been meant to, taking wider strides as I'd been meant to, climbing as I'd been meant to. No one would tell me to get down, not anymore. And this is when he's reflecting on climbing trees as a child and being told by one of his older brothers and by his parents, get down, girls don't climb trees. But again, that's not who Jonathan is. That's how his parents perceive him, but that is not who he is. So now he's on this ship with other men and finally feels like he is in the place where he's always been meant to be. Even so, talks about how working in these types of conditions and doing this difficult manual labor, every muscle in his body is sore, but he's still smiling, still just, feeling glorious about fulfilling this destiny that he so longed to fulfill. We also get this eerie section about the fog rolling in. And there's one point where Jonathan sees this figure in the fog and is certain at first that is the ghost of his deceased brother, Francis. But as this vision comes in closer, he realizes that it's Tarlington, the chief science officer of the ship, the one who found Jonathan and was also like a real jerk to Jonathan. So my anticipations coming up are we seeing any ghostly visions? I'm kind of looking for ghostly visions. I'm looking for more negative sides of Tarlington, the chief science officer. I have a huge distrust of him. The second in command, Clark, I said he's this ass and just very straightforward and grumpy. But I feel like Clark is going to have a character development, an arc, possibly a redemption arc. And that's all I anticipate for this moment. But after I read a few more sections, I will be back to talk more. See you in the next clip. Bye for now. Well, I do have a cold, cough, and sore throat, but at least I'm getting all of the care from the cats. Hello. I apologize in advance for my voice and my appearance, but I feel like crap today. I still wanted to come and do this check-in though to talk about what I've read since the last check-in. I did finish part 1 of All the White Spaces, which was titled The Fortitude, and I read the first section of part 2, which is titled Ice. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the other stuff that I did for this Polar Gothic vlog, and then I will talk about what is taking place in All the White Spaces. So one of the things that I did was to do my annual rewatch of The Thing. Sorry, I had to pause for just a minute so I could sneeze. So I was talking about my annual January rewatch of John Carpenter's The Thing. So a couple of the things that I noticed in The Thing this year that I wanted to just talk a little bit about are the paranoia, and I've noticed this every year, but when I'm reading All the White Spaces, and then I did a little research onto a couple of expeditions that were from like 1910 and 1912 expeditions to Antarctica. But I'm just thinking about the isolation, the paranoia, what happens when you're trapped, even in your house, in a confined space for a certain period of time. But when you're out there somewhere like the Antarctic for extended periods of time around the same people, even if you don't have this alien invader like you have in the thing, paranoia will set in. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the character of Blair in the thing, played by Wilford Brimley. The way that he, as the doctor is doing his research on that computer, and here's spoilers if you haven't watched the thing, so spoiler alert, but he's doing his research on the computer that talks about that if these men are infected by this thing and it gets back to populated areas of the world, that it will ultimately lead to the utter extinction of the human race. So he flips out and is busting up the, equipment, busting up their ways of getting, out of Antarctica to try to keep it from spreading. He's threatening to, unalive the other men who are trying to keep him from, doing this thing. And while, yes, he let his panic get the best of him, at the same time, he's not wrong. This alien does not need to be spread to the rest of the world. So I have a lot of sympathy for the character of Blair. So now I want to talk just briefly about a couple of expeditions to the Antarctic that I watched a documentary about. And again, this is taking place between 1910 and 1912. You had the British expedition of Terra Nova, which was led by Robert Falcon Scott, and there is a Scott base in Antarctica. However, there was also a Norwegian expedition to Antarctica, which was led by Roald Amundsen, and they actually made it to the Antarctic before the British did. Scott's men and Scott himself all died on their way back after their venture to Antarctica, while all of the Norwegian crew, led by Roald Amundsen, all of those men survived. So they talked about some of the different ways that Scott approached the expedition versus the way Amundsen approached the expedition. And I won't get into all of that here, but I will leave some links down in the description box below if you want to check out that documentary and find out a little bit more about those two expeditions. So now I want to get into what is going on in All the White Spaces. Again, like I said, I haven't made it very far in this book, partially because I've got this cold and I don't feel well, but also because it's the kind of book that I'm really slowing down and taking my time to learn more about the history. And I also watched some videos about the climate and the geography of Antarctica, and I can link those down below too. So one of the things that I want to talk about in terms of Jonathan and his identity is the way that he does, as I mentioned in a previous check-in, feel very much at home with these men, very much at home as a man, whereas back at home, he was perceived as a woman. And he's talking about the way that he's able to hide womanly assets here on the ship, but he's also talking about that it's fortunate that he's flat chested. And he goes back and thinks about what his mother said about that. A late bloomer, my mother used to say. It must run in the family. But this was Jonathan's feeling every time his mother talked about, late blooming. She meant the bloom of a flower unfurling, but it made me think of mold creeping over old bread. making my body one I would increasingly fail to recognize. So, this body that Jonathan was born in feels foreign to him. But then on the very next page, Jonathan has got his hair cut short and he keeps on doing this, because he's finally got this haircut that he always wanted. And this is how he's always seen himself. And this is what he says. The first time I'd seen myself with short hair, it had been not a surprise exactly. If the person looking back at me would have been unrecognizable to my parents, he'd been instantly recognizable to me, utterly familiar, as if I'd always known he was there. This body, this look, is the one that feels like home to Jonathan. Quick pause. Sorry about that. I had to pause to blow my nose. That might be TMI, but this is where I am right now and you're watching, so you're just have to be here with me. Then I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Sublime, the Burkean Sublime, Edmund Burke, who wrote about the Sublime and described nature as being a primary example of this idea of the sublime, that which evokes both awe and terror. So Jonathan is talking about how the men on the ship, these men who are missing fingers and toes and, all their experiences in this type of, cold region, just frostbite comes with the territory. And Jonathan talks about how these men talk about the South, meaning Antarctica, like it's a living thing, beguiling and hostile by turns. So that's the perfect example of the sublime. It's beguiling, it's calling these men to, explore this uncharted territory. But at the same time, it's a very hostile environment and a place where possibly people really shouldn't be. This place belongs to nature. So they do reach land, they reach South Georgia, and they reach a certain city that I probably cannot pronounce. But they do, there they stop for a while. They talk with whalers. There are a lot of whalers in this city. Gritviken is the name of the city. It's a whaling station. So I really am not sure if I'm saying that name right or not. But as Jonathan's there, he begins to have a discussion with Harry, who helped Jonathan sneak onto the ship. Harry's starting to have some doubts about continuing the journey. Harry wants to leave. Jonathan wants to stay. I won't talk about what Harry decides. It's probably obvious, though, to you what Jonathan decides, because this book would stop right now if Jonathan didn't continue on the journey. But I'll leave that for you to find out about Harry when you read this book. So one of the things that happens is Jonathan performs this extremely courageous act when the other men are kind of frozen in fear and don't know what to do. Jonathan steps up, and by doing this heroic deed, he earns the respect of Randall, the commander, and he's no longer considered a spare. Randall says, "This is why we have spares. No one else be crazy enough to do that. Morgan," meaning Jonathan, "I don't think we could in good conscience eat you, no matter how low the supplies. We'll boil our boots first." So that is something that did happen. And I found out more about that last year in my Polar Gothic series, episode 1, when I read The Terror. I found out more about commanders boiling boots and eating, boot leather in order to survive. So a couple of other things that I do want to talk about too. When we get to this section, the ice, like I said, I've only read the first part, but I want to talk about the change in the sea. Just these descriptive passages. Ally Wilkes does an excellent job of describing the region in which this book is set. The sea changed from green to deep indigo as the floes started to drift past, the first signs of the winter country approaching with its long night ahead. So, not only do we have these descriptions of, hold on, back again, had to sneeze. Not only does Ally Wilkes do an excellent job of describing the geography of the region, but it's also an example of symbolism and foreshadowing as the sea changes color and you start to see these first signs of winter. Then, if we think about what winter means overall in literary themes, death, darkness, destruction, fear. So, we see this building up. And the whalers had warned Randall not to try to continue on this journey with winter approaching. But Randall's going ahead anyway, as these commanders often did in these expeditions against wise counsel. They're determined to reach this region they're so desperate to see and to claim. They forge on ahead. So that's where I left off. So I will do some more reading and check in again later, hopefully feeling much better. Hello, it's Sunday, January 18th. It's getting close to 5 o'clock in the evening, so I'm losing daylight, so I'll try not to make this too long. No promises. I am feeling much better than I was in the last check-in, so thank goodness for that. So I did finish part 2, The Ice, and when I pick up this book again, I will be moving on to part 3, which is titled The Huts. So let me talk to you about what's been going on since the last check-in. Now, as you saw before I came on to film this part, there will be some minor spoilers in this check-in. So you may want to skip ahead just in case you don't want to be spoiled. But they are minor spoilers. I feel spoilers. I feel like if you're going into this novel, you know that something bad's going to happen. So the ship did catch on fire, and Randall made the command to abandon ship. So now they are trying to get across the ice to the huts. So I'd mentioned before that there was a German expedition that never returned back home. But Carlman, who's leading the expedition, Randall says that he is a master of the ice. So he trusts that he was able to find his way through the ice, and he's just a little delayed in getting back home. So they're setting out, and of course you have some men who want to go back to the ship, and there's an issue that takes place there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So I did mention Tarlington before, who is on the ship, and I had my suspicions about him. He is a conscientious objector, so the other men on the ship who fought in World War I already have these preconceived notions about Tarlington and don't really care for him for that reason. However, something takes place in part 2 that made me think differently about Tarlington. He saves the life of someone who has been accusing him or kind of hinting that he was responsible for the ship catching on fire. So I believe I was wrong in my initial assessment of Tarlington showing up to be actually a not so good guy. I think he is going to be a good guy. So I did also want to talk about the dogs. So again, like content warning for animal sickness, animal death. The dogs they start getting sick once they've kind of been getting sick and dying on the ship anyway. And I can't remember if I talked about that, but it just gets worse in some ways as they get out on the ice. And there's a part where the dogs, some of them break loose and run away. So when the dogs were on the ship, they were sensing when the wind would blow, and very strongly, as of course it would in the Antarctic. They were sensing something wrong. Something was a bit off, something uncanny in the wind. And so I feel like if the dogs are saying, "Hey, something's wrong here," then you may want to pay attention to the dogs, listen to the dogs. And then I also want to talk about this instance when the ship started going down, where Jonathan thought that he saw this smoky like figure on the deck, like this tall, dark figure. And he wanted to go back and save a couple of the men who there was no way that they could have been saved when the ship caught on fire. But he didn't really think this was necessarily one of them. As he began to think about it, it was more like this ghostly presence. And this will come up again in just a little while too. There's also this feeling that Jonathan has about something sinister lurking and waiting for them. So I'm going to read this passage so you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. A gust of wind smacked me straight in the face, and I thought, for a single confused moment, I could see the auroral lights just beneath the horizon and smell thunderstorms. The effect was uncanny. Something just out of sight, waiting for us. So you get that uneasy feeling. And again, that element of the sublime, where you're out in the Antarctic, where the sights are beautiful, but very threatening and very terrifying. Then I also want to talk about the, let me see which part. You got to go with me here. I'm looking over my notes. I blame any absent-mindedness on the fact I'm still trying to get over this sickness. So always good to be able to blame something besides myself, right? Just kidding. So there's also discussion about shell shock, because a lot of these men who are on this ship are veterans of World War One. Of course, now we refer to shell shock as PTSD, but of course, at this time, the way they would have referred to it would have been shell shock. So Harry has been dealing with PTSD throughout the novel. There were times back on the ship when Jonathan and Harry were in that same little area, that same bunk, that Harry would wake up with nightmares. Harry would be talking to Jonathan's deceased brothers, Francis and Rufus, because Harry and Francis and Rufus were fighting together in World War One. And again, there are many others on the ship also that are veterans of World War One, which leads to the tension between some of them and Tarlington, the chief science officer, because of his being a conscientious objector. But there's one part in this too where you have this statement about, in Antarctica, we're all men, because some of these men, when Randall makes mention of, finding Carlman and his German expedition, they make faces or act some kind of way. And that's when Randall says, no, we're all men out here in the Antarctic. And that just speaks to humanity. Humanity doesn't, not worried about borders, not worried about, creating this artificial distance between one group of people and another. Just this idea that we're all humans, we're all people out here. And I really appreciated that. Then I want to talk a little bit too about the Sublime again, and just the effect of being in the Antarctic like this. So this is another description from Jonathan. I saw no horizon and no sky, no ground and no stars. The wind had brought the snow down from the secret interior. It was white all over, a great white darkness, so complete in its absence. That is so eerie to me and so uncanny, this absence. And that again goes to the title, All the White Spaces, because there is all this white space out there. And just this idea that you're just surrounded by this whiteness. It's very eerie. And continuing on with that line of thoughts, Jonathan asked Harry if Harry saw any sort of figure on the burning ship as they were, going away in the lifeboats. And Harry is kind of, dismissive, doesn't really want to talk about it. But Harry's also seeing or sensing something in the cliffs there in Antarctica. So this idea of what is haunting Jonathan and what is haunting Harry? Is it ghost? Is it trauma? Is it guilt for not being able to save men, right? Because Harry survived World War One, where Francis and Rufus and a lot of other men did not, and Jonathan survived the fire on the ship when he had to watch two other men go down in the fire, and he wanted to save them, but he was pulled back because logically there would have been no way he could have saved them. He would have gone down with them. So you're dealing, of course, then with that guilt, that survivor's guilt in both cases. And I find that compelling, the way that Ally Wilkes has, brought in this kind of idea of haunting as a reference to being haunted by tragedy and loss of life and your past. Then I want to talk again about nature and this constant threat, this wind. The wind, it blows up a horrible, 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 huge storm. And that is when I mentioned earlier, some of the dogs are blown away. And you just really get this sense of how strong these winds are, because Jonathan talks about literally being lifted up off the ground because of this wind. So it's threatening, not only the ice, but also the wind. And of course, not having enough food, not having enough supplies, because now they're off the ship, and some of the sledges are blowing away, dogs are blowing away, and then the men are then having to pick up that slack and help pull the sledges, which I cannot even imagine trying to do this. And again, it's this idea too of Antarctica being this sentient being of nature having control over humans. So I want to read another passage to you. The constant threat of those winds returning, the winds that had driven the dogs mad. It sounds ridiculous when I thought of saying it aloud. Terrible winds, as if they had a personality of their own. Antarctica was full of dangerous weather and harsh conditions, but that easterly breeze felt somehow aggressive, territorial. And that leads me into this next section that I want to talk about. As the men approach the huts, and they clearly know that these were the huts that were put up by Carlman and his expedition. But when they get there, there's no German flag flying. Instead, they find an empty flagpole and no one in the huts. There's no sign of life there. And to me, it just really stood out clearly with this idea of no German flag, that Antarctica itself is not allowing any one group of people to take charge of it, to take ownership of it. It is a sentient being. It belongs to itself, and no one can claim it. So I do briefly want to mention too that I listened to a couple of podcast episodes with Ally Wilkes. One of them was the Talking Scared podcast, and the other was Eldritch Girl podcast. And I will link them in the description box below. But I want to talk a little bit about what Ally Wilkes said about why she chose Antarctica and some of her inspiration. So, first of all, she said that she had always been fascinated with atlases, and she was a child and looking through an atlas. And she saw in Antarctica that there's a portion called Wilkes Land. And so, something, just from her childhood being intrigued by a place that had her name. And then she read this book, Endurance, Shackleton's Incredible Voyage by Alfred Lansing. So Ernest Shackleton led an expedition to Antarctica from around 1914 to 1917. His ship was called the Endurance. So then you can see that Ally Wilkes took inspiration from the name of the ship, the Endurance, to call the ship in all the white spaces the Fortitude. So she patterned a lot of what happened or what happens in all the white spaces on what happened in this actual historical, book about Shackleton's expedition. So I haven't read that book, but I may read it. Probably not this Polar Gothic vlog. Maybe next January I'll add a nonfiction book. But I wanted to make sure that I talked about the inspiration behind Ally's reason for choosing Antarctica and for patterning the story as she does. So on the Endurance expedition, however, none of the men, as far as what I could tell reading online, none of the men died, and their ship did go down, and they did have to survive out on the ice. And I believe it was March of 2022 when I think that's what it said when I read the article, that is when scientists finally discovered down in the Weddell Sea, which is the sea in Antarctica where this takes place, the Weddell Sea, they found what was left of the remains of the Endurance. So I thought that was very interesting to know. I also found out that in Wilkes Land in Antarctica, there is a Wilkes Land anomaly, which has to do with gravity. I will link an article down below because I'm still not exactly sure what the anomaly is with the Wilkes Land gravity. It's like negative gravity, but then it's positive gravity. I'm not a scientist. I don't know. Just sounds like there's something weird and uncanny there, which fits with what this book is about. And I also found out that there was this waterfalls there called the Blood Falls, where the water actually runs red. So interesting stuff. So I will be back in the next check-in after I read a little bit of The Huts. Thank you so much for hanging in with me at this check-in, and I will see you in the next check-in. So goodbye. Friday, January 23rd, about 11:30 in the morning, and I am doing my final check-in. I have finished All the White Spaces by Ally Wilkes, so I'm going to talk about the last part of this book, my final thoughts, and give you my final rating. So as we got to this latter half of the book, we really started getting more about the PTSD that these men are experiencing from their time in war. And the book really starts to lean into the ambiguity of whether or not this place, this desolate place, this uninhabited place of the Antarctic is haunted, whether the men brought their hauntings with them. And there's never really a definitive answer. And I like that. I like that it's left up to interpretation by the reader. My interpretation is that there is an element of both, that it is both the trauma that these men brought with them, the pain, the grief, the loss, and also this uninhabited place, this haunting space. So I want to just read now a few quotes about this idea of a haunted place and haunted people. So one of the men states, something makes men uneasy rather. Something makes men uneasy, particularly when they're cut off like this. So isolation. And part of that is, of course, being in Antarctica and being in this isolated part of the world in the extreme cold with winter approaching. So then you have it's the darkness for 24 hours a day. So there's definitely something to be said about this space making men uneasy, but it's amplified by the trauma that these men have brought with them. I also wanted to read this quote again about isolation. And this is very much a description of the landscape, but it is also metaphorical for the literal death that these men have seen, and also that they experience, because we do in this latter half of the book lose quite a few of the crew members. The sun would soon disappear over the mountains for the last time, leaving a darkness as profound as any tomb. We'd been buried alive. So this definitely lends to the cold, the dark, the isolation, and the dread of the place when you're trapped there. But not only are they physically trapped there, but they are mentally trapped there too, with all of the memories that they have brought with them. I wanted to read another section because Ally Wilkes really has a way of evoking imagery that makes it simple for us to picture exactly what it is that's being described. So I want to read this about the aurora. So the aurora australis, according to our main character Jonathan, and some of the other men too, they feel like there is a presence in that aurora, that there is something threatening waiting for them in this place, and the aurora seems to bring it out. So I was listening to those podcasts that I mentioned earlier where Ally Wilkes was being interviewed about this book, and she was talking about how the reports are kind of back and forth, but that some report that the aurora actually makes a sound, which I find to be quite eerie. So I'm going to read this passage. The aurora sizzled and seethed. The storm lanterns creaked and swung in the growing breeze. When the aurora touched the ground, it was green as summer grass and flickered like gas lamps going out. The sky was a gently rippling veil. Lights carried upwards on a vast invisible wind. The hairs lifted on the back of my neck. A pathway. Something was nearly here. So I want to particularly talk about the quote, the sky was a gently rippling veil, because there is the belief that during liminal spaces or liminal times of the year, that the veil that separates the world of the living and the dead is at its very thinnest. So because in this portion of the novel, they are creeping towards the winter solstice, that would be a time of liminality. And this veil is opening a pathway between the world of the living and the dead, whether there are actual ghosts haunting this place or whether they are ghosts in the minds of these men, these memories, and being in this isolated space, being in this liminal time. dealing with the stress of their situation would make them more likely to have encounters with ghosts in their past, whether it's literal or metaphorical. Jonathan also hears voices, as do the other men. They hear voices in the wind. And Jonathan, of course, typically is seeing and hearing his brothers. Harry is also seeing and hearing Jonathan's brothers because Harry deals with a lot of not only PTSD, but survivor's guilt because he did survive World War One, and Jonathan's brothers did not. So Harry has that added layer of stress and guilt. And he keeps mentioning, and we do find out what he did, but of course I won't give it away. But Harry keeps mentioning to Jonathan that Rufus and Francis, those are Jonathan's brothers and Harry's friends and war mates, that they are in the Antarctic waiting for him, haunting him because of something that he did, and they want to get him back for that. You also have a man who disappears into the darkness, never to come back again. You have a few men, but this one particular man disappears even though he is sedated and tied down due to severe injury. So that's really creepy. And there's also mention that all they found of him was a single boot, unlaced and discarded. And it was found at the windbreak leading to the mountains. So that creeped me out. Just this idea of this boot being left and there's no other evidence of where this man went or how he even got out there in his condition and being restrained. This is a really creepy passage. I'm not going to read the man's name, so I'll just say character because I don't want to spoil it. Something had summoned this character from the huts. Something so inexorable, so impossible to refuse, that he disappeared despite the pain, his injuries, the restraints, the dark. So this calling to these men, it is eerie. Then we also have another man who they find out there stripped down to his nothings. He's out there naked, which is something that does happen when you experience extreme hypothermia. You start taking your clothes off, which also I find to be very creepy and horrifying. But this man has been out there so long that his body is just completely frostbitten. He survives for a while. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but the descriptions there are really brutal about the sights, his moanings, the stench of his body as he's going through this. So just be aware that we do get some pretty nasty descriptions of this. So another passage I wanted to read is about a man who, if you have seen The Thing and you remember the way that Dr. Blair reacts and busts up all the equipment, there's a man in this story who does something similar. And it's because he listens to or hears whatever it is that's out there that's speaking to these men. It comes in the form sometimes of people that they've lost. And it's just this part about this particular character, and I won't give his name either, so as not to give spoilers, but I really want to read this part because it does talk about the effects and the trauma of World War One on everyone. This particular man who absolutely lost it, lost everyone. Heaven knows he's not the only one. Every single family back home, missing husbands, fathers, sons, an empty place at every table. Some mothers had aches, terrible pains where their sons were shot, like red hot pokers. Others couldn't sleep for fear they'd miss the sound of them coming home, ringing the doorbell, and no one to let them in. So it's just a reminder of the effect of World War I on everyone, not just the soldiers who went, but their families, and just the way that loss, trauma, grief will continue to permeate the mind of those who have been through something so horrific. Then we also have commentary on the effect of the Antarctic on humans, that it causes them to become paranoid, suspicious, tempers do start flaring, accusations are made about different things, fist fights break out. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else there's so much to talk about. But I did want to mention too, in terms of the paranoia and the prejudice that these men have with each other, especially the prejudice that most of the crew has against Tarleton, who is the conscientious objector. And this is spoiler, but he does end up to be a really wonderful guy. So my initial thoughts were not correct about Tarleton. I thought he was sneaking around and doing something, but we get a couple of really, really big reveals toward the end of the book that had my mouth literally like jaw dropped. Some reveals about a few things. But I did just want to talk about this statement here when it comes to the way that certain people may hold certain views about other groups of people, and how this skews their perceptions, leads to prejudice, hate. And I just think that's a very timely concept right now. So I'm going to read this statement to you. This particular character saw what he wanted to see, what he expected. The evil, degenerate villain. So again, that really speaks to prejudice and perception, and how we can see sometimes what we want to see in other people if we already have these preconceived negative notions about them. So my final thoughts on All the White Spaces. There were parts, I must admit, that I was feeling like it became repetitive. There was a lot of instances where Jonathan continues to talk about there being something in the aurora, something in the wind, something in the darkness, something waiting. And there were admittedly a few points where I was thinking, just let's get on with the story. But by the end, I was so moved in so many ways. The loss of one character in particular moved me to not just slight tears, but absolute sobbing. And Jonathan's finally stepping into the destiny and the life that he's always wanted. And there's a quote, I'm going to paraphrase it, where Jonathan thinks, I am not doing this just to impress my brothers anymore. I'm not doing this just to find my brothers. I am a man in my own right, a man of my own accord. I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I have proven to myself what I've always known. So I know this has been a lengthy vlog, and I appreciate it. If you have watched all the way through, let me know if you've read All the White Spaces and what you thought of it. Let me know any other Polar Gothic books that you would recommend for next year's Polar Gothic episode 4. If you've watched all the way through and you don't know what to say, you can leave a snow emoji for the Polar Gothic. I would love it if you would hit like, subscribe, hit that bell so we can continue to talk about the books that we love. I hope you have a wonderful day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thanks again for watching and happy reading.